everybody. I want to talk today about a grace for healthier conflict. A grace for healthier conflict. Last night, Amy and I were talking about why the kids make fun of us. And Amy noted that one of the three doesn't crack certain kinds of jokes at my expense. But I named another child who seems so much to prefer getting my goat. Amy, to my satisfaction, admitted that this was indeed true, but added in good humor, "That's because you're ridiculous." So today, I want to preach about a grace for healthier I heard that, sister. A grace for healthier conflict for ridiculous people like me. In seriousness, then, I want to say it's a grace to pray about your part in any conflict. That's point one. If you're taking, I know some good people back there in the sheep section are taking notes. So point number one, pray about your part in any conflict. Jesus warned us about how ridiculous we can be. In Matthew 7 and verse 5, you remember he says, first take the eugelviel, the plank, right, out of your own eye. And then you'll be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's. I think sometimes we think that the other guy's got the plank in it. It's the other guy that can't see, right? Psalm 4:4 says, "In your anger, don't sin." Don't miss this mark. Don't mess this shot up, huh? In your anger, don't sin. When you're on your beds, search your heart and be silent. I think sometimes what I need more than anything is just the practice of silent prayer, where I'm not saying anything, I'm just listening. Sit on your beds, search your hearts, and be quiet. There's a universal tendency, I think, to see that others require of others what they do not require of themselves. But there's not a universal awareness that at whatever point I judge another, right? As Paul says, at whatever point you judge another, you condemn yourselves, because you who pass judgment do the same stuff. And so it's amazing how imperceptibly we can treat others with the very kind of treatment that we ourselves are complaining about. Those people are so judgmental. Those people don't know anything about grace. And without realizing it, we have become the same thing that we're complaining about, only we're talking about different matters. So, pray about your part in conflict. A second grace is to pray for the person or persons with whom you're in conflict before you even talk to them. Now here I don't mean, Lord, open their eyes to how ridiculous they are. Now that may be an appropriate thing to pray, but I have more in mind, God, guard their heart. 1 Peter 4 verse 7 says, be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray. Let's get a hold on our own emotions, right? So that prayer is possible. And above all, he says, love each other deeply, verse 8, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Love is about covering over everybody else's mistakes. I know there are times where there are public figures and leaders that are leading people astray, and we know that we have to expose the wicked deeds of people. But in general, in our day-to-day relationships, when we're living with broken people who are broken just like us, love wants to cover over it. Love makes a garment for the naked in the garden, right? And so pray. Pray for those with whom you're in conflict. Before you even say anything, help me protect them, God. And God will probably give you what to say and how to say it. And so you say things like, I think what you meant to say was, I don't think you meant to. You probably didn't realize that. You see? You're praying and you're concerned about how the other person is going to receive this. You're praying about the pain that this will cause them. You're concerned about that, and you enter into that pain with them. That's a grace. I think it's a grace too, number 3, that, well, at least I recommend this anyway as a grace. I recommend private face-to-face communication whenever it's possible. I'm learning these days that sometimes today that might not be always the preferred way to do it, at least not the way I once thought I did. More recent generations think and feel differently about media, and I acknowledge that, and I'm actually learning some things about that. But I'm kind of old and set in my ways too. And I still think that most communication is nonverbal, and that the phone is better than email, and that face-to-face is better than the phone. There's a lot less room for misunderstanding. That is, of course, assuming that the Spirit of God has conditioned your countenance and your tone. Anything is better than drawing attention to the conflict on social media. I mean, you don't take out an ad in the newspaper. Nobody does that anymore, I guess. But in my day, nobody took out an ad in the newspaper and started airing their dirty laundry in front of the whole town. And so today we just do that so effortlessly by pushing a free button. And Facebook will foot the bill just fine. Or maybe they don't foot the social cost of what's going on. Even apologies should generally not be more widespread than is necessary, right? Let alone accusations or complaints or difficulties that we have to raise. Jesus says in Matthew 18:15, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the... And once there's a history of that not being healthy, then bring a person or two along, right, to help smooth things over so that misunderstandings don't become widespread and every matter become established by 2 or 3 witnesses. Just so that there's no misunderstanding, it needs to be kept discreet. That's a grace. A fourth grace is to express that the relationship is valuable to you and that the goal of your communication is to mend things, not to blow things up. Are you with me? Paul told the Ephesians in the 4th chapter in verse 15, speaking the truth in, what was it? Speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into Him who is the head, that is Christ. From Him the whole body, joined and held together, you see. In 1 Timothy 1 and verse 5, Paul insists that Timothy correct certain teachers of false doctrine. And he says, the goal of this command, what was it? The goal of this command is love, which comes from a pure heart. And so make sure you don't have any other motives in the confrontation. No hint, no joke, nothing implied, nothing more than you seem or that you actually do know. Don't assume that they are jealous, resentful, or proud, or at least any more than you are. People just sometimes make mistakes. Have you ever heard that? People will much more readily admit a mistake than they will assume responsibility for wicked intentions which you think that they have. And one of the things that you emphatically do not have any access to is another person's motives. Do you hear that? You don't have access to that. You may think you do. You may occasionally be right, but you don't know. Even when there's a pattern of abuses, or as the Declaration of Independence said, when there is a long train of abuses and usurpations. Even when that's so, try to assume the motives are good. I mean, subsequent history kind of bore out, I think, that George III may have had some mental problems, and George III may have had some incompetent ministers, but Canada and Australia are not suffering under an absolute despotism, right? They even let them go free without a war. And so we are schooled in the culture, right, to blow things up when we don't like it. No, our goal is not to have a war or to have an independence. Rather, Philippians 4 and verse 8 says, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. That word think about occurs 30 or 40 times in the New Testament. And it always, except in this case, is translated credit. Whatever is lovely or pure, credit that kind of motive to the person. Think about those things. Countenance or credit those things. The first lesson in any counseling, when you go into any kind of counseling profession, is that people are almost always trying to accomplish something good, even when they do something spectacularly stupid. Evil is a distortion of the good. It doesn't have any telos or end or meaning in itself. Evil is always a parasite. Evil is almost always trying to accomplish something good in a diseased way. Evil just distorts what's good. And so Paul says, if anything is praiseworthy at all, if you can see what other people are trying to accomplish, that's a praiseworthy goal, then credit that motive, even when something is really foul or has adverse consequences. So express, this willingness that the communication be loving and mending, and that express what the relationship means to you, and that relationship is more important than the conflict, and we don't want to let the conflict ruin the relationship. And then it's a grace further to express the exact nature of offenses in terms of concrete specifics. Be clear in your own head about the kind of harm you're experiencing. Here again, I'm not talking about judging people's motives. We could go there again, but I'm concerned that we not catastrophize things, make things worse than they are. Our fears and our anxieties and those kinds of things, they just invent political or potential, well, the political too, but they invent potential consequences that are not present. You with me there? Sometimes we imagine what's going to happen as a result of this before it actually happens. So do your best to keep the stakes what they are. Don't raise the tension and the consequences unnecessarily. Jesus said each day has enough trouble of its own. Isn't that right? Each day's got enough. Jesus taught us that God knows how to look after the lilies and the sparrows. And the God of the cross can bear the relational crimes of the world and set things to rights. So, talk about just what happened. If you feel like you have to express your fears, take ownership of your fears. The other person's not responsible for them. And so it's a grace also, not only to express the exact nature of offenses in terms of specifics, but it's a grace in the midst of that kind of conversation to listen to the other person actively and generously. Actively and generously. Listen for their story and the resonance, the way a word resounds stories and memories and images in the other person's mind. You hear me? Listen for the way a word resounds their stories and images in their mind. I was interpreting what I considered to be really bad behavior one day last week. And after the person came to me and apologized and explained the reason for his behavior, and that included telling me what he didn't know that I thought he did know, right? It all became very understandable. And my hurt and my anger just evaporated. Isn't that something? Philippians 4:7 says, "The peace of God which transcends all understanding," is not the promise. You're right? That's not, it says that it transcends our understanding, but that promise is not a promise of a mystical state that just soars above all conflict. Rather, Paul is saying, God's got a peace, and that peace knows how to change your perspective on how things are working here. Transcend could be also translated overcome. God's peace, God's interest in a peaceful relationship can overcome your perspective on how this thing is progressing. Sometimes we are completely right about what's going on, and the other person can see it, and that person usually apologizes, but the real problematic conflict, the persistent kinds of conflict, are frequently about people fearing different sides or different poles of a truth that's in tension. God is able to overcome one-sided perspectives. And when we listen generously and actively, God does that in a conversation. When I say when we listen actively, we say, what did you mean by? What did you mean by that? That's one of the most powerful. When I do premarital counseling, I don't do a whole lot of stuff. I don't think it does much good. But one thing I do, and I hammer this, I say, you have to ask people what they mean by what they say. 2 Timothy 2:14 is an often neglected scripture. Paul told Timothy, I don't want to hear any of this quarreling about words. Quarreling about words. I don't have a full picture of what Timothy's context was, but I suspect that like all fights, people say things like this. But you said blank, right? But you said this. I read poetry. Sometimes it's because I like it. More often than not, because I don't. Good poetry, you see, takes a level of patience that I sometimes need but don't have. And so I make myself read poetry as a kind of spiritual discipline. Why? Why would a person do that? Because poets use words in unexpected ways that unveil new realities that escaped us. Active listening knows that what any poet knows, that you haven't learned a word just by reading the dictionary. All my life I've believed that a welt, right, was a whelp. My mommy had told me when I was little, oh, you got a whelp on your arm. The dictionary and my wife convinced me that I didn't have a puppy on my arm, but that I had a welt on my arm, right? And I've got a degree in English. Most people don't, right? Most people don't. If the goal of dealing with conflict is love, then love listens for how a person is using words and doesn't try to force or impose meanings on others. You know, dictionaries exist after the fact. In the 18th century, they decided, well, let's create a dictionary and let's standardize this stuff. How did they decide what the words meant? They went and asked people how they were using the words. Dictionaries are often wrong or at least incomplete anyway. You probably will not find, if you open Webster's, a whole series of definitions for words that are used in theological language. They just don't mean the same thing. You have to listen for the way the person himself or herself is using the words. Otherwise, every argument will end up being an argument about the definition of the word that they used. Every time. And Paul says this, verses 14 and 15 of 2 Timothy do, it is of no value, and it only ruins those who listen. Listen not for the way you use words. Listen not to the way some dictionary writer uses words. Listen for the story and the images that the other person is trying to convey, because you're trying to love the person, not impose a form of speech pattern on them. You see? Now, we know a lot about this, right? And there's a war in the culture about, what do we call it, political correctness? There's a war about how you use language, because if you impose certain ways of using language on another group, that's an act of power. It's not about love, it's about political power. If we can control the language the other side uses, we can control the argument. God's not interested in that. God's interested in love and peace and relationship and listening carefully to how the other person is trying, inarticulately. I mean, how many of us, when we're sad and lonely and afraid and irate, do a great job expressing ourselves? Right? It doesn't work that way. So listen generously and actively for the other person's heart and intentions. Yes? And pray for lastly, it's a grace to pray for the person after conflict. Pray for the person after conflict. And by this I don't mean some imprecation. Some curse on that person for being such a pain, right? Bless and don't curse. There were times in Israel where Israel's rulers put opposing nations into the hands of God's own judgment, but these cases of anathema is not what I'm talking about today. Now pray that God would bless the relationship and encourage the other person, even when reconciliation hasn't happened and there may be big problems on the horizon. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you or who are after you. Now, of course, the obstacle to being generous and just letting stuff roll off your back, what's hard about praying and discovering and naming our part in conflict, right? The difficulty of praying for the person we need to confront before we confront them. The difficulty of facing our emotions and speaking discreetly and directly to the other person. The hurdle of placing a relationship above our own feelings and a relationship above our own interests. The challenge of not making mountains out of molehills, or at least Himalayas out of the Appalachians. But staying with the exact nature of the wrong at hand. The block which prevents us from listening generously and praying with and for those who hurt us is what the Bible often calls the flesh, the sarx. Now, the flesh is not your body. The Bible's use of the word flesh is not a standard dictionary definition. And so don't open Webster's up and say, Paul, you're misusing that word. Okay? No, it's not the body, though the confusing thing is the body is weakened by and exemplifies the flesh. Our bodies get tired. Our bodies pump fear chemicals. Our bodies create fight or flight reflexes. They instinctively protect our pride, dignity, and our assertive wills. But this assertive will, what Paul calls the sarx, what Paul calls the flesh, right, is not something that can be overcome by the power of the will, because our willpower is dominated by the sarx, dominated by the flesh. What the NIV sometimes calls our sinful nature. But the good news today is that the rule of the Spirit of life has set me free from the law of sin and death. Are you with me here? The rule of the Spirit of life has set us free from the rule of sin and death. For what the rule? For what the law? You know, the law. The law you hear in things like a 7-point sermon about what to do in conflict when you're grief-stricken and irate and afraid. That law. The one Moses taught. One that Israel lived with and knew and received. For what that law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh. Weakened by the sinful nature. God did in sending His own Son. Right? And so the rule of the Spirit of life, which comes to us in Jesus Christ by faith, at the gift of baptism is the gift of cleansing and the receiving of God's Spirit. That it would flood over you and in you and empower you and make you alive in a new way. Yes? Haven't we taught that about baptism for years? It's not about just getting dunked and doing the law, right? It's about pouring oneself out on the mercy of God and asking the Spirit of God to make our spirits alive again. For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the sinful nature, God did in sending His Son, and now the rule of the Spirit of life can set us free from the rule of sin and death, and we can come to Jesus. We can approach the throne of grace. Isn't that right, Aaron? We can find divine help in time of need. The Spirit of God can work in us. The Spirit of God can do what my sinful, ridiculous sarx cannot. If we would just open ourselves up to His grace and offer others the very same gift as we stand and respond to that invitation.